Who can take a flower, roll it up and make it fine, sprinkle it with knowledge and a little bit of time, cover it with headlines and a sweet euphoria too. Cannabis Man, Cannabis Man can. Who can take a story and make it feel so grand, spread the word around about the wonders of this land, mix it all with laughter and a sprinkle of insight. Cannabis Man, Cannabis Man tries. Oh, Cannabis Man, spreading news and joy across the land, diving deep into the growing green. Cannabis Man, we're all king. Ooh, ooh yeah. Ooh yeah. Ooh yeah. Cannabis Man, spreading news and joy across the land, diving deep into the growing green. Cannabis Man, we're all king. Ooh, ooh yeah. Ooh yeah.
Ooh, yeah, it feels good to be back. Welcome to the Cannabis Man Podcast. Thank you so much for clicking on the show. I'm your host, Don Kleppin. And if this is your first time here, welcome. It's a show where we're trying to take a journalistic look at all things cannabis as everything is changing in the United States and around the world in different countries, seemingly day by day in the legal cannabis markets. There is always a lot to talk about, and I love bringing conversations to you with people in the space, whether those are entrepreneurs, business owners, creating new goods and services, if they are policy leaders and people who are in the political space, keeping track on the timelines for some of these initiatives to legalize cannabis and end the prohibition, such as my guest today, my friend David Culver of the U.S. Cannabis Council, who's here to talk about exactly that and the rescheduling timeline that we are in the midst of. Or it could be people who are doctors, researchers, trying to answer some of these questions that we still have about cannabis. Anybody who is in the space I like talking to, and I love bringing those conversations to you, and I also love hearing from you. You can always text into the show by scrolling down and clicking on that link in the description notes. Follow the show at C-Man Podcast on X and Instagram, and do me a favor, leave a rating or review if you haven't already. That's the way that these podcast platforms kind of know how to distinguish the shows that are worth showing off to people, is ratings and reviews from listeners like you. So if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you could do that for me. And if you want to become a patron and support the show on Patreon, you can scroll further down in the description and click on the support the show link there. I know you've already likely heard the news, President Biden deciding to withdraw from the presidential race and endorse his Vice President Kamala Harris for the Democratic nomination. That's big for a lot of reasons, and certainly concerning cannabis and the timeline for rescheduling down to Schedule 3 from Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act. And the public comment portion of this rescheduling process just wrapped up yesterday from when I'm recording this. So I thought, who better to talk with this news about than my friend at the U.S. Cannabis Council, David Culver. I'll bring you that interview a little later in the show. I've also got some products to tell you about, some local news around Illinois and some events coming up, as well as a noteworthy national article that I'm looking forward to sharing with you, all on this episode of the Cannabis Man Podcast. Here we go.
This is Tommy Chong, and you're listening to the CannaBiz broadcast.
And it has been a little while. I took a bit of a break. If you have missed the last few episodes, my daughter Violet was born in April, and I took the month of July off as my wife Gretchen returned to work so that I could help ease that transition. And as such, I've kind of been just on a little bit of an unplug session, which has been nice, but I have not been able to escape the news. What a cycle it's been. Politics, cannabis-wise, there has been so much going on. It's just been crazy, and I felt compelled to jump back on the mic and spend some time with you. So thanks for joining me here. Thanks for clicking. It is good to be back, and I would like to start by sharing with you the News Joint Wrap. This is a wrap-up of news stories relating to cannabis in or around Illinois, and it's all brought to you by IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Think of it as the joint you can hit for all your Illinois cannabis news and reviews. And let me start with an article from earlier this month talking about the low medical cannabis sales numbers. They've dropped to a 4-year low. According to Jason Brown here, the Department of Public Health relayed its June medical cannabis sales totals earlier in July. They dropped to $23,105,926. That would make for the lowest monthly sales total since before Illinois legalized recreational cannabis in January of 2020. Jason breaks down the specific sales numbers from dispensaries further on in the article. Another news story worth bringing to your attention, Governor J.B. Pritzker touts $1 billion in cannabis sales along with social equity efforts here in Illinois. In a press release, he said that the state reached $1 billion in cannabis retail sales and, quote, continues to lead social equity efforts nationwide. This marker of $1 billion was passed July 1st. It breaks down $850 million in sales of adult use cannabis and almost $150 million for medical cannabis sales. That relates back to the dynamic I've talked about a few times on the show. There are definitely, and by significant factors, as you see by those numbers, there are way fewer medical patients buying cannabis from dispensaries than there are just adult use buyers. Those include people who live in the state who don't have medical cards, people who are just passing through from other states, or who are coming here as cannabis tourists, as has been reported widely that people from states like Wisconsin and Indiana, places near Illinois that don't have these legal markets, they're coming here and they are buying in droves. I know they're also going to places like Michigan, and I know they're going to other places as well, including soon Ohio, which put out its first batch of legal cannabis licenses this week. Just yesterday, from when I'm recording this, very, very exciting news here in the Midwest in terms of cannabis movements. And then in the press release, Pritzker also touted the fact that 100 social equity dispensary licenses have now been given out, and those operations are up and running, which makes Illinois a leader in the social equity space regarding legal cannabis sales. And for my money, I think he should be touting that as progress. I know that not everyone feels great about the prices in Illinois. I can't tell you how many times I've rolled my eyes combing through internet comments of people making the same joke about Illinois prices. But I've said from the beginning of when I started this podcast, prices were going to come down as competition increased. And there were 3 years in Illinois between 2020 and 23, which, for those of you keeping track, was just last year. Just last year, those lawsuits were settled, and a lot of these social equity licenses were then released to get their operations up and running. This competition was tied up in courts for 3 years. That, as much as anything else, is why Illinois prices were as high as they were. But now these other doors are opening. These competitors are driving prices down. But importantly, at least here in Illinois, the quality of our products is still staying high because the incentive for these businesses is still here, unlike some other states in the country, which I've talked about on previous episodes. Back to the News Joint Wrap, there are a few events that I thought were worth bringing up here, including the Illinois Craft Showcase Consumption Event. This is happening September 7th at Molly's Joint in Tilton, Illinois, running noon to 7 p.m. The Craft Showcase is set to highlight nearly all Illinois craft licensees, including growers and infusers. Anyone attending, you'll have the opportunity to meet the new brands represented representatives and sample some of the best products in Illinois, which, as I was just alluding to, is a high bar. The first 250 tickets are free, but have to be reserved at a link which you can find at IllinoisNewsJoint.com lower in this article, which I've shared below in the description notes. And one other event I thought you should know about coming up this week is the Black CannaBiz Expo and Conference, running July 24th through 26th, so Wednesday through Friday of this week, at the Swiss Hotel in Chicago on East Wacker Drive, right next to the WGN radio building. I see the Swiss Hotel every time I go into work there. Great building, and they have a wonderful restaurant, The Palm, in there. And if you haven't checked them out and you're going to this conference, maybe take a swing over there. They got some good drinks, and they have some really good food to offer, too. So definitely worse places that you could kill time between the different guests and presentations available at that conference. And as always, you can find out more information about those events and news stories, as well as many, many more, all at IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Now I'd like to get on to my product of the week, strain of the week, if you'd like. Today I had some coffee earlier in the day, and I have been pulling on this lovely vape pen from Canna, and I'll talk more about that in a different episode, but I wanted to cheers you before I got into my thoughts on this other product here. Cheers. It's a sativa pen. Raspberry Skywalker is the flavor, and again, I'll talk more about that at another time, but right now, I want to tell you about this right here from the lovely people at Canna. You may remember I had a conversation with the CEO of Canna, Cameron Clark, a little while back, and you can check out that episode. I highly recommend it. They have some really great insight in that episode Cameron shares, but also the company in general is paying attention to the right things, and they talked about their special formula that's been triple lab tested for guaranteed quality and safety, and they are the original creators of the fast-acting nano gummies. And these Canna Bliss gummies are also touted as fast-acting. They say you can feel it in about 15 minutes. So I was thrilled when they sent over some of these products that I could try out and finally get a taste about, all right, does this really hit in 15 minutes? And after having tried these, and the ones I'm talking about currently are the energy gummy variety. The flavor is citrus splash, and it comes in a green package. Love their logo. Love the green on the package. I'll share a picture below. But this energy gummies, and I'll talk about the sativa and indica ones another time, because all of these gummies are pretty good. But the one I had to tell you about first, the version of Canna gummies that I needed to tell you about, were these energy gummies. You can see on the front of the package, it's got THC and THCV. Now, that's a cannabinoid that's starting to get a little bit of buzz, and I've talked about it with some of my guests. It has some interesting potential that has been shown in terms of the appetite suppression space, as well as boosting energy, which I can tell you now from experience, these gummies absolutely do. There's 10 milligrams in here, so even though my tolerance is good, I usually expect to feel those. And what was so interesting about these is that I definitely felt it, but it was maybe the first cannabis product I've tried where I didn't feel stoned at all. And by that, I mean I didn't feel inhibited in any way, mentally or physically. I wasn't glued to the couch. I wasn't sort of low bandwidth in the old brain, you know what I mean, where your thoughts are kind of circular or maybe, not escaping a certain low level. That's not at all what I experienced here. I experienced a nice kick in the pants in the midday when I've taken to taking these things. Normally around 1 or 2 o'clock, I might have some coffee. I might have a sugar-free Red Bull if I'm feeling particularly lethargic, let's say. That happens from time to time. So instead, I was swapping with these energy gummies after I took them for the first time. And I love them. I've been taking them like every day because I find that boost of energy with the no cost in terms of feeling stoned. And what I mean by cost is you're not limiting yourself in terms of what activities you can do. Now, granted, I haven't been going to work. I've had the month off, but, these gummies allowed me to do things like chores around the house and some projects that I've been working on the side and just spending time with Violet and stuff. It gave me the energy to do that without, limiting my choices in terms of what I was comfortable doing, what I had the energy to do. These things are great and for very different reasons than some cannabis consumables that I've tried in the past. And most of them, I'll say, these are kind of in a different lane, I found anyway. And I'd love it if you give them a try and tell me what you think. You can text the link in the description notes. But these Canna, K-A-N-H-A gummies, I'm going to talk about the other varieties and that Raspberry Skywalker vape pen at another time. I'm going to share those reviews on future episodes, as well as in the inaugural edition of a newsletter that I have coming out. I'll talk more about that on the next episode. But for right now, I just wanted you to know that I have been loving these Canna Bliss gummies, and you can find out more by following them on Instagram at Canna, K-A-N-H-A, Bliss on Instagram, or CannaBiz.com. Listener, I had a few things that I wanted to share with you. It's obviously been a little bit of a while since I had a new episode out, and there's been a ton of news over the last 3 or 4 weeks. But this past weekend, there was some major news regarding President Biden and his decision to bow out of the presidential race and endorse his Vice President Kamala Harris, who is now the Democratic nominee, presumptively, but that's the way that I think we can all be comfortable running ahead with that. So now it's a race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris for the presidency. And obviously, with the ending of the public comment period for the DEA considering the rescheduling of cannabis ending yesterday from when I'm recording this, there's a lot to consider with cannabis, with regard to cannabis over these next few months and heading up to the presidential election and thereafter. And so I wanted to speak with an expert, not only in the field of cannabis, but DC politics, and someone who has their ear to the ground over there to talk a little about what's expected in regard to how Kamala Harris feels about cannabis and what her past record speaks to. And I couldn't think of anyone better than the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at the U.S. Cannabis Council, David Culver. Welcome back, David.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with you again.
Hey, my pleasure, man. I always appreciate you coming on. And you do, I feel like you really are somebody who's been in the political space for a while. You are plugged in, you know what's going on. And I love talking with you about politics as cannabis, certainly, but just kind of what the climate is in the nation's capital. And so, given that the big news of the week is that Joe Biden is out and Kamala Harris is now, presumably, I'm not sure that she's spoken to accept it yet, but we all, the president's endorsed her, the other major Democrats have endorsed her. So let's start just by talking about Kamala Harris and what her policies, or at least what her feelings that you think or can gather from her past about cannabis are, and what we can expect in this space in the next few months here.
Well, what a week is exactly right. And I'll even say what a month. I think it's been some of the most interesting politics over the last 4 weeks that I probably have ever witnessed in my lifetime. And you're right, I've been at this for a long time. But in terms of the new Democratic nominee, Vice President Harris, the cannabis industry generally, and myself included, is very excited about her candidacy. And I also think that we can talk about the politics of this race, but even with all the momentum that President Trump has gained over the last few weeks, and I still think he has a significant amount of momentum. I do think there's a number of things that we will see with Vice President Harris, nominee Harris, over the next month that will help to bolster her candidacy as well. So in any case, it's an exciting time, and I think that she's going to be very, very good for the cannabis industry on this stump over the next few months, and certainly has a legitimate chance of winning the entire election.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I'm glad you put it that way because, former President Trump did really gather a lot of momentum in these last few weeks. There was the assassination attempt right before the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, so it just sort of, leaned in such a way, those events where, the the very week after that assassination attempt, which obviously, he survived and he was hit in the ear, but the injury is very, pretty superficial, I would say, compared to what it could have been. And of course, I just want to put out there that whoever, it is that you support, whatever policies you're into, I definitely don't want to see any presidential candidates getting shot at, or Senate candidates, or, House members, anybody running for office. That's just not any kind of way to have a civilized discourse and all that. But David, as you mentioned, those events, along with, the other ways that Trump has always been pretty good at gaining momentum, using social media, using, news events and talking about things that people are thinking about. He's good at gathering momentum for himself that way, and he has certainly done that. But then this past weekend, Joe Biden announcing that he's going to step aside and then endorsing Kamala Harris, the VP, for the seat. It's just an incredible confluence of events, just one after the next. So it has been absolutely crazy. But, you say that you're excited about Kamala Harris, and I've heard from the, other members of the cannabis community that they are very bullish on her as well, that they think that things just got better for cannabis on the Democratic side of the ticket. What is it about, what she's done in the past maybe, or her record about cannabis so far that maybe speaks to some of this excitement people are feeling?
Yeah, I think she's been on a journey in terms of cannabis reform, like many of us have been, including myself. And she's a former prosecutor, and I think she was able to see firsthand the impact that the war on drugs was having on individuals and communities in the state where she was working. I think that her journey in the Senate progressed significantly. She was a lead co-sponsor of a comprehensive reform measure called the MORE Act, which still exists on the House side. And she also engaged in a number of other pieces of legislation that were cannabis reform specific, where she added her name as a co-sponsor. Inside the White House as vice president, she continues to support what President Biden has been advocating for on cannabis reform, and she also has pressed on both HHS and the Health and Human Services and also the Department of Justice to expedite the rescheduling decision. So I think if you look back at where you look back at her journey and you look back at President Biden's journey, they're both from different generations, and President Biden comes at this from a very, very different angle than the Vice President does, and he's had his own journey on cannabis reform, which I think really began 2019-2020 for President Biden. And the way I'm thinking about this is that he got the ball rolling, and then if she ultimately is elected, she's going to be able to take the ball and run with it even further than President Biden was comfortable doing. The other thing to mention, which I think is yet another reason why the markets reacted so positively yesterday, and also why the industry sources that you're speaking to are so keen on her candidacy, is that this is going to be a very simple, the fact that she is being nominated with her background on cannabis reform, she's going to be the most cannabis-friendly presidential candidate that we've ever had in U.S. history. And I think this is probably also going to be the last time that, certainly on the Democratic side, that there is a candidate that is not for full-blown legalization. And I do think that we're going to see a softening of the position on the Republican side as well going forward.
Wow, that is really cool to hear, David. I mean, you're to your points as well. I mean, you're absolutely right. I did see that evolution in the Senate of Vice President Harris. I remember the MORE Act. That was exciting. And just briefly to touch on President Biden's journey with cannabis and such. I've talked about on the show before how I respect him so much as a person, because I remember talking one time about how many 80-year-olds do you know that would change their stance on an issue as fundamental to somebody's identity as maybe like drug policy or the value of cannabis in terms of what it can do to a quality of somebody's life? And President Biden in his own home with his son Hunter, it's like there's been a very public story unraveling, I suppose, of his own history with substance use. And so I respect Biden a lot for changing his mind, as you kind kind of mentioned 2019, 2020, really evolving on his stance about it. But that highlights the distinction between him and where he came from versus Vice President Harris, who, as you said, in the Senate, as her time as a prosecutor in California, she has been on the front lines of litigating some of these issues regarding social justice and how it relates to the cannabis laws and the federal prohibition of cannabis and all these things. So you can kind of see just on the surface there where they come from. You can kind of see already that Harris would be a lot friendlier toward cannabis. And you mentioned, David, before about the rescheduling. I do want to get to that because we're recording this July 23rd, the day after the public comment period ended, and I was able to get my comment in. I hope you were too, listener. But before we get to that, you also mentioned this softening of the viewpoint toward cannabis on the Republican side. You think this is the last presidential election where there won't be a pro-legalization candidate on the ticket? And I'm curious how, this also relates to the Republican VP nominee, J.D. Vance. Where does he stand on cannabis, if you know it all? And this softening that you're kind of thinking of, what does that look like in terms of the candidates that we'll see in this election and then going forward?
Well, just to be clear, the comment I was making is that I do think that this is a historic moment with Vice President Harris that we will have on the Democratic ticket a pro-cannabis reform candidate that has advocated and will continue to advocate for cannabis to be removed from schedule and for the war on drugs to formally end. So that unto itself is very historic. And
right.
I think that the next presidential cycle, I think it's fair to say that it is the last time. President Biden was probably the last candidate on the Democratic ticket that we will ever see that does not advocate for a full descheduling of cannabis.
Gotcha.
And ending the war on drugs. But I do think that on the Republican side, we're going to see a significant softening on the position there. And while they may not come out in full favor of descheduling cannabis, I do think that there's going to be a more nuanced position that takes a middle approach during the next presidential cycle, simply because the numbers are just too good and they get better and better for cannabis reformers with Republicans every year. So whether it's looking at cannabis, medical cannabis, and support for that across the country, those numbers are pulling in the 70s and even 80s. And adult use now is pulling very highly with Republicans, especially those that are under 40. So, as folks get older and as the older generation moves on, you're, I think, going to see more and more support. In terms of J.D. Vance, we don't know a lot about his feelings on cannabis, with the exception of the fact that he dealt with substance abuse at home. He has been against the Safe Banking Act, which you and I have talked about on your show previously.
Yep.
He has also been against adult use in the state of Ohio. He's been very vocal on that, but he has kind of qualified all that by saying that he is still very much in favor of states' rights, which is the approach that we currently have with cannabis reform. But again, he's obviously important. He's on the ticket, but I do think that there are others in the Republican Party, significant numbers in the Republican Party that their position is going to change. And I know you want to talk about rescheduling as well, but when and if cannabis is moved from Schedule 1 down to Schedule 3, it's going to be sitting next to Tylenol with codeine versus heroin. And so I think a lot of conservative policymakers that have been uncomfortable working on cannabis reform issues are actually going to be much more comfortable going forward. And final thing I'll say is just back to your opening comment about President Biden. I think you hit the nail on the head. He has watched substance abuse at home. He has spent decades legislating on drug policy, and often in a way that was very much against what the U.S. Cannabis Council advocates for. But I do think that he took the time to listen during the 2020 election cycle, and he was convinced that he needed to change his approach, and he did. And for someone at his age, and given his personal background and his background as a legislator, I think that was probably hard to do. But he did it because he felt that it was the right thing to do. And like I said, he started the ball rolling on historic cannabis reforms in October of 2022. And I just cannot say enough good things about what he's done and how much respect I have and my colleagues have for what President Biden has done.
Well said, David, because I feel that exact same way. And I felt that way a few times in this presidency, and perhaps never more so than when he announced he was stepping aside and not seeking the nomination of the Democratic Party. I mean, I just think that there's so much that reveals a lot about somebody's character, especially when you're in an office as powerful as the President of the United States. And there are people, and I will say, just my personal opinion, somebody on the other side of the ticket who, once they get in that office, they'll do anything they can to stay there. Meanwhile, the guy who was there and had the nomination, and, it was totally his choice whether to stay or go, he decided it was better for the country, Biden did, to step aside. And I just cannot say enough about how much I respect that decision, because I know how difficult it must be for somebody. And then, to that point about J.D. Vance and substance abuse at home, I didn't know that, but we know that Ohio has just partially gone forward with its legalization of cannabis, at least in certain parts of that state. It's very limited, but I know that Ohio is starting down this path, and we know that J.D. Vance has already changed his mind about President Trump as a candidate, so maybe he'll change his mind about what's right for states to do about cannabis.
He very well may, and I want to make sure that I'm very clear with your audience that this discussion thus far has been very skewed towards the Democratic nominee, and I am very excited about her as a nominee. So I want to be clear about that. But I also want to be clear that those that are cannabis reformers, we are eager to talk to any elected official, whether it's a Republican or Democrat. We would love to work with President Trump if he's elected or as a candidate. We definitely tried while he was president, and we tried going into the last election cycle. And that door is always open for us. So any elected official that is still on the fence on cannabis reform or uncomfortable with cannabis reform, we'd like to have a conversation with them and try to work with them. And even if it's to find an area of reform that is small, but something that they're comfortable doing. So I just want to be very clear that
sure. I
don't think cannabis is a partisan issue in any way, shape, or form. And it becomes less and less partisan every day, and certainly will if cannabis has moved down the schedule.
Totally. Yeah. And thanks for clarifying. I know that that's true of you guys. I know that, your whole goal with the USCC is to advance cannabis and get it out of its prohibited state currently with social equity and the expungement of criminal records, high ethical standards, and a safe and responsible cannabis industry. I know that you guys are really focused on those, and I know that you don't care about, which party you're talking to. It's the elected officials that you're trying to change the minds of, regardless of their affiliation and whatnot. And I really appreciate that about the work you guys are doing. And on that note, we've been talking a little, just around the rescheduling here. And I wanted to ask you, we mentioned before that the public comment period has ended here, and that ends one chapter of this rescheduling process. First, let me ask if the changing of the guard here, like if President Biden bowing out, if that has any effect on the timeline, and then let's just talk about that timeline. What are we looking at here in terms of what's next, and then how long this rescheduling limbo period we're in, how long might this stretch out?
Well, this is absolutely moving at an expedited pace. So this is what President Biden called on both the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice to do in October of 2022. And it has absolutely moved very, very quickly compared to others, to other efforts. But let me touch on the politics real quick, and then I'll get back to the process. The politics of this election still dictate that the Democrats in this particular administration get this final rule done before the election. And I think that cannabis is a big issue. It may not be the biggest issue In fact, it is not the biggest issue that they're going to run on, but it is a big one. Mm-hmm. I also think that it's a bit of a sleeper issue in that they're going to be able to use it very, very effectively in November. So if they are able to get it done prior, and by done I mean issuance of final rule before November, I think this can be very helpful. And I am, as we have discussed previously, a betting man. I do have the over-under set on this one at October 1.
Okay.
And I'm personally taking the over on that one, but that's the politics. The process of this could 100% get gummed up and delayed. We are very much moving rapidly, as I said. It was excellent that they were able to get the public comment period closed yesterday in the month of July. So plenty of time for them to review the comments, even though there are a significant number of them.
40,000 at last check, I believe.
That is right, but just keep in mind that many of them are going to be automated, and they're going to be looking for unique comments versus those that are the automated letters that are just sent in over and over and over again.
I see. Okay.
So they're going to be able to move through it, I think, with relatively good speed. And in my mind, the question about the final rule getting done before November really hinges on whether there's an administrative law judge review and or hearing. And if there is a law judge review and hearing, then that could very much slow the process up. And some folks have argued that it could be a year plus if that's the case. So let's assume two different scenarios. Number one is that let's assume that there isn't an ALJ hearing or even a review, and that the final rule is published at some point in October and prior to the election, or even published before the end of President Biden's term, assuming that the vice president loses, the Democrats lose. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case and the final rule has been published, then this is going to be challenged in court. And I'm going to shelve that discussion for another day. But in terms of what the new president could do, if it is President Trump, if he chooses to try to unravel this, they wouldn't be able to just keep this final rule on the shelf. So keep in mind that the DEA actually doesn't have a time limit on how long they could or should take in order to issue final rule. So they could potentially just sit on this, put it on the shelf and sit on it, never issue the final rule, and this discussion becomes null and void as a result of that. But if this comment is issued prior to the end of Biden's administration, then they don't have that ability. Their ability would actually hinge on them restarting the conversation. So again, going back to October of 2022, President Trump could initiate the same review that President Biden did, but given the thorough scientific review that HHS did and the fact that there would be even more state-level cannabis data that they would be able to pull from, I think it's going to be very difficult to overturn whatever decision this administration makes. Now, that's one scenario. The second scenario is that President Trump loses and President Biden, I'm going to keep saying President Biden.
It's tough. It's new. This is so new.
This is all brand new. Vice President Harris wins. And of course, then this could stretch out longer if need be. And I do think that she would finalize the job at some point during the first term of her administration. Plus, I think that she would engage on other cannabis reform measures per the position that she had in the Senate previously. So I personally don't think that, for even if President Trump had the opportunity to try to unravel this or to ask his two agencies to review, I don't think he would do that. And I think this is an issue that politically just doesn't make sense for them to get involved with, especially knowing that they could lose.
Right.
Based on the sound science that we know HHS has produced.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Thanks for laying out both those scenarios, because I know that these are questions that a lot of my listeners have, that even people in the space covering this, I know that it's very murky in terms of what the timeline could be. And as you said, I think you kind of laid out the different factors there pretty well. And I agree with you. I do think that the public support, the polling of legal cannabis in the country makes it a non-starter for the Republican side to wade in on, because I think that there's A, there's the risk, as you said, that they could lose the election, and B, it's not only Democratic Americans that are, supporting legal cannabis. It's certainly not. There's a lot of Republicans that are enjoying it, whether it's because they found a quality of life benefit, like it helps them with chronic pain, or any of the list of the things that could help with, or maybe it's just the revenue. That's if for the side of the ticket that is, more concerned, or, that advertises that they're concerned with like the fiscal budget and stuff like that. You cannot ignore the new revenue that cannabis has brought to the country. I was seeing an article the other day that just between California and Michigan, there's like $3 billion or something like that those two states made so far this year. So I think that speaks to kind of why you wouldn't want to necessarily wade into this if you're a member of the other side of it. But I do want to ask, who would initiate that judicial review that you were talking about of this, after this public comment period is now over? If that administrative review happens, who's the one that decides it? Because if it's the DEA, and as you mentioned, they did clarify, they sent that letter earlier this year saying, hey, there's no timeline on this. If the DEA is in charge of whether or not there's a judicial review, I have to imagine that they're going to enact it, because their actions thus far have not been of an agency that is definitely trying to move cannabis into the decriminalized status, or even reschedule it down to 3, which would be great. But I know that you mentioned HHS a couple of times, and the Justice Department and the White House. I think all of them are a big part of what's moved this rescheduling process along. For my money, and this is just my personal opinion, I think the DEA is not going to go against their own self-interest and say that there's a substance that now they have less control over. So I think that they would probably gum up the works if they can here, but maybe I'm wrong about that. What do you think, David? Are they playing a role in this?
Yeah, they're absolutely playing a role in this, and the final rule that is published will be the DEA's decision. So they have the ability, of course, through this, as I mentioned before, this administrative law judge review and or hearing. They have the ability to do both. They have the ability to take as long as they would like on this, and they have the ability to change course. They have agreed thus far with HHS, as you know, but pending the administrative law judge review and or hearing, they could potentially change their position on this. So the answer is yes, that there is a lot of power that's still within the DEA's hands, but the debate now is very much divided about what they're going to do. And in fact, I was on the phone yesterday with a series of attorneys that have been very, very involved with this through the scheduling coalition that the cannabis industry formed more than a year and a half ago. And they are really the subject matter experts on the legal side, and there's widespread disagreement about what's going to happen. A lot of real head scratching. They also were very clear that we will know when there's an administrative law judge hearing or review when it's announced, and we're not going to know previously. So,
Gotcha.
They have to make sure that this process is being followed to the letter of the law. It has been thus far, but everything that's remaining in the process are things that we are going to find out and not know in advance.
For sure. Well, hey, and if that's the case, I'm going to take the over along with you, man. If the line is October 1st, I'm taking the over on that one too, unfortunately. But
you should take the over, and I appreciate that very much. I will send you my Venmo so you can send me your money.
Sounds good.
I also still believe, though, that the politics are as powerful as anything in this. And while this process has not been political in any way, shape, or form, they have followed the procedure to the letter of the law. There is no reason why this cannot be finalized prior to the election. So while I say I'm on the over side, I still believe that they're going to get it done in October and that they use it in the weeks leading up to the election.
For sure. And I hope for that as well, man, because as you said earlier in the discussion, that would be a huge boost, I think, for the Democratic side. And I think that, if they would certainly love to be enjoying that come October. And I think the rest of us would as well. That would be a nice thing heading into the end of the year, the holidays before a potentially contentious election, to just celebrate the fact that cannabis is going to be rescheduled, which I know that there are people out there who they feel like that moving it down to Schedule 3 is not enough. And I agree with that, but it's a crucial step on the road to getting it lower than that. Hopefully, just taking off the scheduled or the controlled substances list altogether. That sort of thing would be amazing. But this step, even though it might seem like it's not enough, it is a big step. And David, I really appreciate you coming on and just kind of spelling out for us the different angles here and kind of what we could be seeing in the next few months.
Well, you're great to have me. I always appreciate being on with you. Thank you so much. And let's all stay tuned over the next few months. It's going to be a really interesting time, as always, in the cannabis reform space.
And there you have it, listener. I want to thank one more time my guest, David Culver, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at the U.S. Cannabis Council. They are doing really important work at the USCC. I've talked about them before, not just in my conversations with David, but, ever since that I had the chance to, first get connected with him. I've really enjoyed our conversations, and I just can't say enough about the good work that USCC is doing. Other big industries in this country, whether we're talking about energy, pharmaceuticals, food, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, go down the list, tech, any major industries that are bringing in billions a year, they have a presence on Capitol Hill. And they do that to maintain relationships with lawmakers and try to nudge or at least preserve their self-interest, the interest of the industry at large. And cannabis has needed an advocate like this for years, for decades, ever since the Prohibition started, let's say. And now that is exactly what USCC is doing. So if you want to find out their policy priorities, you can head to uscc.org. And one national story I wanted to get to, it's related to a topic that David and I were talking about, and that would be the rescheduling of cannabis. And there's an article out just yesterday from when I'm recording this. It came out July 22nd, Monday, and it's the headlined, "Report finds rescheduling cannabis would create over 50,000 new jobs." This article comes from the Marijuana Herald. I love the work they do, and Anthony Martinelli is the author specifically. He's always on the good scoops. I love the work that he does. The article goes on. It says that these creation of 50,000 new jobs would be by 2030 if cannabis is rescheduled as proposed by HHS, the Justice Department, and the DEA. This comes from a report titled "The Economic Impact of Cannabis Scheduling Reform on Small and Minority-Owned Businesses," commissioned by the Minority Cannabis Business Association, the MCBA, and conducted by Whitney Economics. The report was posted as a public comment to the DEA yesterday, they say today in the article, which, again, as I mentioned with David, was the deadline for doing so. I was able to get my comment in yesterday. I will link to it on the show's socials once I get word that it's been approved. That's part of the process when you leave that. I hope you were able to get it in and get your support on the record. The MCBA surveyed 206 marijuana licensees across 32 states, uncovering trends within the industry that they say are concerning. Only 27% of respondents reported profitability, while 41% were breaking even and 36% were operating at a loss. Now, 41% is pretty high for just breaking even, and that 27% profitable, that's definitely concerning. You're talking about a quarter of the entirety of the marijuana industry that is reporting that they're not yet profitable. I think the breaking even is probably a lot of early businesses, early starters, which we know there are a lot of those in Illinois, just getting their licenses, just getting their operations up and running, and all these new states like Ohio that's just now getting those licenses out. It's going to be a while before those stores get built and before the product gets rolled out and before their operations are up and running. So myself, I'm not overly concerned, but it is something worth watching. This percentage breakdown of which businesses are profitable and which ones operate at a loss. But as David and I were kind of talking about and alluding to, once this rescheduling, if it does go through and when it does go through, the impact it's going to have on the cannabis industry overall is going to be enormous. This article goes on to say that this report found exactly that. Financial and tax issues were identified as major economic challenges by over 80% of the businesses. Rescheduling, quote, would lead to substantial tax savings and increased profitability for marijuana businesses, including small and minority-owned businesses. Without the tax reform that rescheduling would bring, many small and minority-owned marijuana licensees will go out of business, causing major economic losses and unemployment. This is, again, according to that MCBA report. I've linked that article below. You can read the rest of it. I always encourage you to follow along and check those out. Any article that I bring up, I always link in the description notes. And send a text down there, also linked in those notes. Let me know what you thought about that story. Do you expect that rescheduling is going to happen? If it does, do you believe that 50,000 jobs number by 2030? Do you think it's going to be more than that? Are you taking the over like David is, and I am as well, in terms of this timeline, October 1st being that line? We will be watching. It'll be very interesting to see this process play out with these curveballs that we've all been thrown over the last few weeks, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how it all plays out. I'm sure you are too, and I'll be bringing it to you here on the Cannabis Man Podcast. Follow the show on the socials, and be sure to leave a rating or a review. Support the show through Patreon via the link. All of that you can find at the link in the description notes, including that text me link. Let me know what you thought about this and any other episodes of the Cannabis Man Podcast. I'll be back next week. Bye-bye. Cannabis Man is 100% originally crafted by myself, Don Kleppin. Original theme music written and composed by Yusu Kim, aka Goodson.